Good afternoon, fine people of the interwebs. I'm James Crawford. On this channel, I document my own journey starting a business in Kenya, where I'll be moving to in about 12 days. But I also create videos on topics that are much more general to international development and work being done in Africa. I've learned a ton in my own journey, and there's so many fascinating topics where we think one thing's going on, but typically there's a lot more underneath the surface. And that's what I want to dive into. Specifically, cute little kids. Even more specifically, orphans and orphanages. I'm all about the kids, and I'm pretty sure you are too.
You know me. Anything for the kids.
Orphanages exist to take care of kids that don't have families to support them. In theory.
People who open orphanages and look after children who are orphans in their orphanages are doing something incredible, aren't they?
I think so.
The answer to that question would be no. Orphanages are not what we think they are.
Crap. But before we talk any further, we need to talk about this word orphan, because the way you and I use it and what we think of when we think of orphan is not how orphanages use that term. When you think of an orphan, you probably are thinking of someone who has either lost both parents or has been abandoned in some way. And that's typically how orphan's been defined. That is until the mid-90s and the early 2000s when that term was broadened due to the AIDS pandemic that was ravaging Africa and other parts of the world. It made sense in that context to broaden the definition of the term orphan because the effects of AIDS were so widespread that even if one parent passed away, that typically meant that that child couldn't be supported. The good news is that the international communities had dramatic success in turning the corner on AIDS.
This comprehensive plan will prevent 7 million new AIDS infections, treat at least 2 million people with life-extending drugs, and provide humane care for millions of people suffering from AIDS and for children orphaned by AIDS.
And that's why you're not really hearing about the AIDS crisis in Africa, because it's not really a crisis anymore, and that's great. But the broadening of the term due to that crisis is still being used even though the crisis doesn't really exist. And so you and I still think of children who have no parents or have been abandoned, but orphanages are still using this broadened term.
When I could communicate properly with the kids, I began to uncover some strange things. Most of the children that we had removed from the orphanage were not, in fact, orphans at all. They had parents. And the few that were orphaned had other living relatives, like grandparents and aunties and uncles and other siblings.
That was Tara Winkler, who's an Australian woman talking about her experience in Cambodia. But this isn't an issue that is just in certain areas in the world. This is widespread. I've seen it personally in Uganda where a family was fighting over whether or not to have their child in an orphanage and up for adoption. The mother thought it was best for the child, but yet other members of the family wanted to keep the kid. And at the same time, an American couple was spending tens of thousands of dollars to fly into Uganda and adopt this child that they thought had no family at all. And a very similar story played out in the documentary Poverty Inc. based on a situation in Haiti.
My wife Shelley and I moved to Haiti in 2008 to adopt a child.
I saw a picture of a little Haitian kid on the internet and fell in love with the idea of Haiti and a child from an orphanage and being able to give a parentless child a family.
He's my new brother.
The orphanage director had asked us if we wanted to meet the child's mother. And we were kind of surprised because the thought was, well, wasn't he abandoned by somebody, or didn't he lose his parents, that kind of thing.
Poverty Inc. is a great documentary. It's on Amazon Prime. If you haven't seen it, I'll link in the description below. It covers a lot of topics. Highly recommend you watch it.
So, why were these children living in an orphanage when they weren't orphans?
That is a great question.
Couldn't find any orphans that didn't have parents. They all had parents. And when you really get into it, well, of course they have parents, because an orphan's a coveted position. It's school, it's books, it's maybe even a visa, maybe even an adoption.
We're creating a dynamic where we're pitting the biological bond between parents and a child alongside that desire within parents to give that child the best life they possibly can.
In fact, data from UNICEF Save the Children and Home and Hopes for Children points out that out of the 8 million children who are thought to be in orphanages worldwide, At least 80% of them are not orphans.
There absolutely are orphans who don't have family, but they're the exception here. They are not the norm.
And the number of children living in Cambodian orphanages has nearly doubled, despite the fact that the vast majority of children living in these orphanages are not orphans in the traditional sense. They're children from poor families. In Uganda, for example, the number of children living in institutions has increased by more than 1,600% since 1992.
Is poverty a reason for separating children from their families? Or do we need to rethink orphanages?
The vast majority of orphans are poverty orphans. But there's another element to this story, one that I'm also culpable in, and it's this idea of orphanage tourism, where we go on trips to developing countries and go visit these kids in orphanages. People certainly go there with the best of intentions. I myself, I've even gone into an orphanage. But the truth is that institutional care, which is what orphanages are rife with problems.
Over 60 years of international research has shown us that children who grow up in institutions, even the very best institutions, are at serious risk of developing mental illnesses, attachment disorders, growth and speech delays, and many will struggle with an inability to reintegrate back into society later in life.
Let's focus in on one of those, attachment disorder. These kids have either been given up by their families or they're permanently disconnected from their family. Yet we think it might be a good idea to go to these orphanages, play with these kids, shower them with love, and then leave, get them on this emotional high, and then never see the kids ever again. That's a recipe for disaster.
We've learned these lessons before in Australia. It's what happened to our stolen generations. The Indigenous children who were removed from their families with the belief that we could do a better job of raising their children.
With the belief that we can do a better job raising their children. To me, that's the core issue at hand. It's not the misinterpretation of what is or isn't an orphan. It's not the AIDS pandemic that changed a lot of the situations on the ground there in Africa and other places. It's our own arrogance that we think we can be better parents for these kids, but also the complete lack of belief that we have in parents in these developing countries. But we mask over all of that in our good intentions.
It's the well-meaning support from people like me back in 2006 who visit these children and volunteer and donate, who are unwittingly fueling an industry that exploits children and tears families apart. It's really no coincidence that these institutions are largely set up in areas where tourists can most easily be lured in to visit and volunteer in exchange for donations.
I hope you're getting the idea that orphanages are a problem, but at the same time, what do? There are actual orphans, and there are lots of families who struggle to provide adequately for their children. So what can we do about it?
There is a solution.
Yes!
These problems are reversible and preventable. And when we know better, we can do better. The organization that I run today, the Cambodian Children's Trust, is no longer an orphanage. In 2012, we changed the model in favor of family-based care.
Both the women in the TED Talks that you've seen snippets of, both of them transition from orphanages to family-based care. Family-based care is a solution, it's not the solution. The reason being is that there's still hundreds of thousands, if not millions of families who need this type of support. Yet family-based care is never going to scale to be able to meet that need. So while it's good, there are no silver bullets in development. And like we said, most orphans are poverty orphans. The issue really is poverty. And so when I look at this issue, it's a combination of things we can do now that at best are band-aid solutions, but then let's also focus on long-term solutions that look at the core issues like poverty, so that we don't have to go to each and every family in poverty and donate them in a one-off fashion, because that's never going to meet the full need. And so the solution is both. Let's do family-based care, but let's also try to find other solutions that actually scale and try to focus on the long-term issue, which is poverty. And that's where I see my role in all this, is to do business in Kenya, hopefully create hundreds, if not thousands of jobs and inspire others to do the same. And in doing so, these families and the communities can then support the children. One of the other potential avenues to explore as I was researching this was, what about organizations like Give Directly, which transfer money directly from donors to poor families. Since poverty is the core issue, give them cash. Let them make decisions for themselves. It's not a silver bullet, but it's definitely a more cost-effective solution than family-based care. The point being is, these issues just aren't that simple.
I know that it can feel incredibly depressing to learn that helping vulnerable children and overcoming poverty is not as simple as we've all been led to believe it should be.
But I would also go back to, Africa is not as bad as you probably think. These communities, these societies, they care for each other so much. They lean on each other. And while they might not have as much material possessions as you and I, they're every bit as happy as we are. And so sure, they're striving for more education and health for their families, and we want so much more for them. They want so much more for themselves. Though it's important when we are presented with this situation about how desperate the people are in Africa or other places in the world, we shouldn't just take it at face value. We wouldn't take it at face value if we were talking about children in America. We'd dive into the issue and try to figure out what exactly is going on there. And we should have the same logical, analytical approach in dealing with things in Africa. Because when we don't, a lot of money gets wasted, and we often have a worse effect than if we did nothing at all. But ultimately, this is meant to be a conversation. What are your thoughts on the issue? So feel free to leave your comments below. If you liked it, maybe give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed already, would love you to hit that button down there. And let me know if you like this, and maybe I can make some more videos. As I said, heading out to Kenya pretty soon. Definitely a lot of other topics to address, and also video blogs of me in the factory trying to get my own business going. So love you take part in that. Until then, peace, peace.